In the quiet village of Eldermere, where the forests whisper secrets older than time itself, a young blacksmith's apprentice named Cael stumbled upon something that would change his life forever. Deep in the woods, hidden beneath a canopy of ancient trees, he found a dragon at its surface, shimmering with patterns that seemed to dance in the dim light. As his fingers brushed against it, a strange warmth surged through him, and a faint voice echoed in his mind. "Protect me." That single moment marked the beginning of a journey Cael could never have imagined. Unbeknownst to him, this egg was no ordinary find. It was tied to an ancient prophecy, one that spoke of a bond between dragon and rider that could either save their world or plunge it into darkness. But as the village elder warned, there were others who sought the egg, ruthless hunters known as the Shadow Riders, who would stop at nothing to ensure dragons remained a relic of the past. Now, as the shell begins to crack and a new life stirs within, Cael stands at the edge of a destiny he cannot yet comprehend. Will he rise to the challenge, or will the weight of the prophecy and the danger it brings be too much to bear? This is the story of courage, sacrifice, and the unbreakable bond between a boy and a dragon. A tale that will remind us all of the power of hope, even in the darkest of times. Cael's forge had always been a place of steady rhythm and predictable warmth, but the moment he hid the egg beneath the pile of scrap metal in the corner, everything changed. At first it was subtle, a hammer that seemed to shift places on its own, tongs that clattered to the ground without explanation. Then, the forge itself began to burn hotter than ever before, the flames licking higher and brighter, as if fueled by something otherworldly. Cael tried to brush it off, chalking it up to his own exhaustion or a trick of the light. But deep down, he knew the egg was the source. One night, as the embers glowed in the darkness, a faint cracking sound echoed through the forge. Cael rushed to the corner, his heart pounding, and there it was, the egg, splitting open to reveal a tiny, silver-scaled dragon. Her eyes flickered with an intelligence far beyond her size, and when she looked at him, Cael felt a strange, almost magnetic pull. He named her Lyra, after the constellation that had guided him through countless sleepless nights. As the days passed, Cael discovered Lyra was no ordinary creature. She grew at an astonishing rate, her scales shimmering like liquid moonlight. Even more remarkable was her ability to communicate, not with words, but with emotions, waves of warmth, curiosity, and even flashes of humor that seemed to resonate directly in his mind. It was as if she could sense his thoughts and feelings, and in turn, he could feel hers. Together, they formed a bond that felt both ancient and entirely new. But the quiet life Cael had known was slipping away. Strange lights began to flicker from the forge at night, casting eerie silver beams into the sky. The villagers, already wary of Cael's solitary ways, started to whisper. They spoke of unnatural fires, of shadows that moved where no one stood, and then came the rumors the Shadow Riders were coming. These mysterious figures, cloaked in darkness and known for their relentless pursuit of anything magical, had been spotted in the surrounding lands. Cael knew what that meant. If they found Lyra, she would be taken, or worse. With a heavy heart, Cael packed what little he could carry: tools, food, and a few keepsakes from the forge that had been his life's work. Under the cover of night, He and Lyra slipped out of the village, leaving behind the only home he'd ever known. The wilderness stretched before them, vast and unfamiliar, but Cael felt a strange sense of purpose. Lyra perched on his shoulder, her small form radiating warmth and determination. Together, they stepped into the unknown, driven by the unspoken promise of a destiny neither could yet fully understand. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. Cael's life as a simple blacksmith was over. A new chapter had begun, one filled with danger, discovery, and the unbreakable bond between a man and a dragon. The dense canopy of the Whispering Woods stretched endlessly above Cael and Lyra, its ancient trees towering like silent sentinels. Each step they took seemed to echo against the stillness, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Lyra's presence, though quiet, seemed to stir something deep within the woods. The air grew warmer, and faint, glowing lights began to flicker among the roots and branches, as though the forest had awakened from a long slumber. The wind carried whispers, soft and indistinct, as if the trees were sharing secrets only Lyra could understand. Cael couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was alive, watching them. His hand tightened on the hilt of his sword, but there was no immediate threat, only the strange, almost comforting pull of the land around him. For the first time, he felt a connection to something greater than himself, as if the earth beneath his feet was guiding him, urging him forward. But that fleeting sense of peace was shattered in an instant. From the shadows, a low growl echoed, and the air grew cold. A pack of shadow wolves emerged, their eyes glowing like embers, their forms shifting and flickering, as though made of smoke and darkness. These were no ordinary beasts. They were servants of the Shadow Riders, relentless and deadly. Cael drew his sword, his heart pounding, but before he could act, Lyra stepped forward. Her hands glowed with a fiery light, and with a fierce cry, she unleashed a burst of flame that sent the wolves scattering into the darkness. The forest lit up briefly, the flames reflecting in her determined eyes. But the battle had taken its toll. Cael stumbled, clutching his side where a wolf's claw had grazed him. The wound burned, but he forced himself to stay upright. Lyra's expression softened with concern as she guided him deeper into the woods, her small hands steady against his arm. They soon found refuge in a hidden cave, its entrance overgrown with ivy and glowing moss. Inside, the air was cool and still, a stark contrast to the chaos they had just escaped. As Cael tended to his wounds, his thoughts turned inward. The weight of their journey pressed heavily on him. Lyra was stronger than he had ever imagined, but he couldn't shake the doubt creeping into his mind. Was he enough? Could he truly protect her from the dangers that lay ahead? The flickering light of the cave's moss cast long shadows on the walls, mirroring the uncertainty in his heart. For now, they were safe, but Cael knew the road ahead would only grow darker. And he wasn't sure if he was ready to face it. The air in the cave was thick with the weight of centuries, a silence broken only by the faint echo of Cael's footsteps as he ventured deeper. The walls around him seemed to hum with a hidden energy, and as he raised his torch, the flickering light revealed something extraordinary: ancient carvings etched into the stone. They were intricate, depicting figures astride majestic dragons, their forms frozen in moments of triumph and despair. Cael's breath caught as he traced the lines of one particular image, a silver dragon its wings outstretched, surrounded by symbols of both destruction and salvation. A prophecy, he realized, one that spoke of a silver dragon who would either save the world or bring it to ruin. His heart pounded as the pieces clicked into place. Lyra, the dragon who had chosen him, who had trusted him when no one else would. She was the one from the prophecy. The weight of that knowledge pressed down on him, threatening to crush his resolve. How could someone like him, a simple village boy, be tied to something so vast, so impossible? For a moment, doubt crept in. Should he turn back, leave this burden behind, and return to the life he once knew? But then he felt Lyra's presence beside him, her steady gaze grounding him. She had chosen him for a reason. She believed in him, and that belief, fragile as it was, gave him the strength to move forward. As they stepped out of the cave, the sunlight felt almost blinding after the dim interior. But before Cael could take a moment to adjust, a shadow moved in the corner of his vision. A figure emerged from the trees, cloaked in dark leathers and carrying an air of quiet authority. Her eyes, sharp and calculating, fixed on Cael and Lyra. "So," she said, her voice low and steady, "you've found the silver dragon." Cael tensed, instinctively stepping closer to Lyra. The woman held up a hand, her expression unreadable. "Relax, I'm not here to fight you. My name is Ellara. I'm a Dragonrider, or what's left of one." Cael's mind raced. Ellara's presence was both a threat and an opportunity. She claimed to know the ways of Dragonriders, to understand the bond between rider and dragon in ways he could only dream of. But her intentions were unclear, her motives hidden behind a veil of mystery. Could he trust her? And yet, what choice did he have? He was out of his depth, stumbling through a world he barely understood. If he wanted to survive, if he wanted to protect Lyra, he needed guidance. Reluctantly, Cael nodded. "Train me," he said, his voice steady despite the storm of uncertainty within. Ellara's lips curved into a faint smile, and for the first time, Cael felt the faintest glimmer of hope. The journey ahead would be perilous, but with Lyra by his side, and now Ellara's guidance, perhaps he stood a chance. The path was set, and there was no turning back. As the trio ventured deeper into the rugged terrain, Ellara led Cael and Lyra through a narrow, hidden pass. The air grew cooler, the scent of pine and earth filling their lungs, until suddenly, the landscape opened into a breathtaking vista. Before them stretched a lush, secluded valley, its emerald green fields dotted with towering trees and glistening streams. But what truly stole Cael's breath were the dragons, majestic creatures with wings that caught the sunlight like molten gold, soaring gracefully above the cliffs. His heart raced as he watched them, their roars echoing like distant thunder, a symphony of power and freedom. Ellara turned to him, her voice calm but firm. "This is where the last of the Dragonriders have found refuge. Here, you will learn what it truly means to bond with Lyra, to become one with her spirit and her strength." Cael nodded, though a knot of uncertainty tightened in his chest. He glanced at Lyra, who stood beside him, her eyes gleaming with a mix of curiosity and trust. She was growing stronger every day, her scales now shimmering with an almost ethereal light, as if the very essence of magic pulsed beneath her skin. The training began at dawn the next day. Ellara guided Cael through ancient rituals, teaching him to quiet his mind and open his heart to Lyra. The bond between rider and dragon is not just physical, she explained. It is a connection of souls, a shared understanding that transcends words. Kael tried to focus, but doubt gnawed at him. What if he wasn't strong enough? What if he failed Lyra, this incredible creature who had chosen him? Each stumble in his training only deepened his fear, and he began to question whether he was truly worthy of this destiny. Yet, despite his struggles, something extraordinary was happening between him and Lyra. When they stood together, he could feel her presence in his mind, a warm, steady pulse that seemed to whisper encouragement. Her strength was becoming his strength, her courage fueling his own, but there was something else, something darker. Kael couldn't quite put it into words, but he sensed a shadow lurking within her, a growing power that felt both awe-inspiring and unsettling. Was it his imagination, or was Lyra's light beginning to flicker, as if something ancient and untamed stirred beneath the surface? Ellara noticed his hesitation. The bond is not without its challenges, she said gently. Dragons are creatures of immense power, and with that power comes great responsibility. You must learn to trust not only Lyra, but also yourself. Her words lingered in the air, a reminder that the path of a dragon rider was as much about inner strength as it was about mastering the skies. Kael took a deep breath, determined to push through his doubts. After all, the fate of the dragon riders, and perhaps the world, rested in his hands, and somewhere deep within, he knew that Lyra believed in him, even if he didn't yet believe in himself. The sun hung high over the valley, casting golden light across the training grounds where Kael and Lyra practiced. The air buzzed with energy as Lyra stretched her wings, her scales shimmering like molten gold. Kael guided her through a series of maneuvers, his voice steady but firm. But something felt different. Lyra seemed restless, her movements sharper, her breath hotter. Then, in a split second, it happened. A surge of raw energy erupted from her, a blinding flash that tore through the air and carved a jagged scar into the valley floor. The ground trembled, and the echoes of the blast lingered long after the dust settled. The other dragon riders gathered, their faces a mix of shock and unease. "This is too much, Kael," one of them said, his voice low but firm. "You're pushing her too hard. She's dangerous." Others murmured in agreement, their eyes darting between Kael and the smoldering crater Lyra had left behind. Kael clenched his fists, his chest tightening as their words sank in. He wanted to defend her, to explain that Lyra's power was still growing, still untamed. But the accusation hung heavy in the air, reckless. Ellara stepped forward, her voice calm but resolute. "Lyra's power is unlike anything we've seen. It's not recklessness, it's potential, and Kael is the only one who can guide her." Her words were a shield, but Kael could feel the cracks forming. The others weren't convinced. Their trust was slipping away, and with it, his confidence. He loved Lyra, but doubt began to creep in. Could he truly control her, or was he just fooling himself? That night, as the campfire crackled and the stars painted the sky, Kael wandered the edges of the encampment. The weight of the day pressed on his shoulders, and sleep felt impossible. As he passed a cluster of tents, he heard voices, low, urgent whispers. He paused, his breath catching as he recognized the words. "The prophecy," one voice said. "It's her, Lyra's power. It's the key, but if she can't be controlled, it won't just be the valley that's destroyed. It'll be everything." Kael's heart raced. He had heard whispers of the prophecy before, fragments of an ancient tale about a dragon whose power could shape the fate of the world. But hearing it now, tied so directly to Lyra, sent a chill through him. The voices faded, but the words lingered, echoing in his mind. Could Lyra truly be the one destined to save, or destroy everything? He returned to her side, watching as she slept, her breath steady and calm. For the first time, fear crept into his thoughts. He had always believed he could protect her, guide her, help her harness her power, but now the stakes felt overwhelming. What if he failed? What if Lyra's power was too great, too wild, even for him? Kael made a silent vow that night, his voice barely a whisper. "I'll find a way. I'll learn to control this, for you, Lyra, for all of us." But as the stars glimmered above, he couldn't shake the question gnawing at him. Was he protecting her, or standing in the way of her destiny? The line between hero and Harbinger felt dangerously thin, and Kael wasn't sure which side he stood on. The air was thick with tension, as Kael and Lyra stood at the edge of the Whispering Forest, the first stop on their mission to retrieve the ancient artifact. The elders had spoken of its power, a relic forged in the fires of the old war, capable of shielding the valley from the Shadow Riders' growing darkness. But the journey ahead was no ordinary task. The forest, alive with magic, seemed to pulse with a warning as they stepped inside. Twisted roots snaked across the ground, and the trees whispered secrets in a language neither could fully understand. Every step felt like a test, a challenge laid out by the valley itself. Lyra moved with a grace that belied her size, her scales shimmering faintly in the dappled light. Kael kept close, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. They had trained for this countless hours, mastering their bond, learning to anticipate each other's movements. But nothing could have prepared them for the reality of the forest's defenses. Vines lashed out like serpents, and glowing runes etched into the ground sprang to life, conjuring barriers of light and shadow. Each trap required quick thinking and trust. When Kael faltered, Lyra's instincts guided him. When Lyra hesitated, Kael's resolve steadied her. Together, they pressed forward, their bond growing stronger with every obstacle they overcame. As they ventured deeper, Lyra began to share fragments of her past. She spoke of a time before the Shadow Riders, when dragons and humans lived in harmony. The war had changed everything. The Shadow Riders, once allies, had turned to dark magic, seeking to enslave the dragons and harness their power. Lyra's voice carried a weight of sorrow, but also determination. She had survived the war, though many of her kin had not. Her connection to the artifact, she explained, was no coincidence. It was tied to her lineage, to the dragons who had fought to protect the valley long ago. The artifact itself lay hidden in a cavern at the heart of the forest. The entrance was guarded by a massive stone door, etched with symbols that mirrored the ones on Lyra's scales. As they approached, the symbols began to glow, and the door creaked open, as if recognizing her. Inside, the air was cool and heavy with the scent of ancient magic. The artifact rested on a pedestal, a crystalline shard, pulsating with an otherworldly light. But as Lyra drew near, the shard reacted, sending a surge of energy through the cavern. Kael watched in awe as the light enveloped her, revealing a vision. A battlefield bathed in fire, shadow riders descending upon the valley, and Lyra at the center of it all, her wings spread wide in defiance. The vision faded, leaving the cavern in silence. Kael's heart raced as the weight of what they had seen settled over him. The battle was coming, sooner than anyone had anticipated. The artifact wasn't just a tool for protection. It was a warning, a call to arms. Time was slipping through their fingers, and every moment counted. Lyra turned to him, her eyes reflecting the same urgency. They had found the relic, but the real test was just beginning. As they left the cavern, the forest seemed to watch them, its whispers carrying a new message. The valley's fate rested in their hands, and the shadows were closing in. Back in the valley, tension hung heavy in the air as the Dragonriders braced for the inevitable. Cael, driven by a fierce determination, threw himself into training with Lyra. Each day, they pushed harder, their drills growing more intense, their movements sharper. It wasn't just about strength and amour, it was about understanding. Cael began to feel the depth of their bond in ways he hadn't before, a connection that seemed to hum with energy, as if their very souls were intertwined. But amidst this growing unity, he couldn't ignore the subtle shifts in Lyra's behavior. She was restless, her amber eyes often darting to the horizon, her wings twitching as though yearning for something unseen. Then came the night that changed everything. Under the pale light of the moon, Lyra took to the skies without warning, her silhouette cutting through the darkness. Cael, startled but unwavering, followed her. They soared higher and higher, past jagged cliffs and swirling mists, until they reached a mountain peak that seemed to touch the stars. There, Lyra let out a deafening roar, her body glowing with an otherworldly light. A torrent of energy erupted from her, spiraling into the heavens like a beacon. Cael watched in awe, his heart pounding. This wasn't just raw power. It was a call, a plea. Lyra was reaching out to something, or someone, beyond the veil of the night. As dawn broke, the valley stirred with an eerie stillness. Cael and Lyra returned, but the calm didn't last. The shadow riders descended like a storm, their dark dragons blotting out the sun. The attack was swift, ruthless, and calculated. Cael's mind raced as he mounted Lyra, his grip tightening on the reins. The bond they'd forged in training would be tested now, not just by strength, but by trust. As the first clash erupted, the valley echoed with the cries of dragons and the clash of steel. Cael knew this was only the beginning. The battle had come to them, and with it, the answers to the questions Lyra had been silently asking. But those answers would come at a cost. The valley erupted into pandemonium as the shadow riders descended from the skies, their dark dragons casting long, ominous shadows over the once peaceful land. Cael and Lyra stood side by side, their blades clashing against the relentless onslaught of enemies. Though their courage burned bright, the sheer number of foes pressed against them like a suffocating tide. Every swing of their weapons was met with a dozen more, and exhaustion began to creep into their movements. In the midst of the chaos, Ellara's voice rang out, sharp and urgent. "Cael, you must go. her eyes locked with his, filled with a fierce determination that left no room for argument. Before he could protest, she turned and charged into the fray, her magic flaring like a beacon in the darkness. Her sacrifice bought them precious moments, but the cost was unimaginable. Heartbroken, Cael hesitated, his grip tightening on his sword, yet Lyra's hand on his arm pulled him back to reality. "We can't let her sacrifice be in vain," she whispered, her voice trembling but resolute. With heavy hearts, Cael and Lyra fought their way to the edges of the battlefield, gathering a small band of survivors as they fled. The cries of the fallen echoed behind them, a haunting reminder of the stakes they now faced. Their journey led them to the ruins of an ancient temple, hidden deep within the forest. Moss-covered stones and broken pillars marked the entrance, as if the earth itself had tried to reclaim this forgotten place. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of damp stone and age-old secrets. Cael's fingers brushed against the carvings on the walls, tracing symbols that seemed to pulse faintly with life. It was here, in the heart of the temple, that he discovered the map. Etched onto a crumbling piece of parchment, it revealed the location of the dragon's heart, a mythical artifact said to hold the power to reshape the world. Lyra's eyes widened as she studied the map, her voice barely above a whisper. If this is real, it could change everything. Cael's resolve hardened as he looked at the survivors around him. They were battered, but hope flickered in their eyes. The dragon's heart was no longer just a legend. It was their only chance to turn the tide of this war. And though the road ahead would be perilous, Cael knew they had no choice but to follow it. The prophecy had spoken of a hero who would rise in the darkest hour, and now, with the weight of Ellara's sacrifice heavy on his shoulders, Cael understood what he had to do. The fate of their world depended on it. As the first light of dawn painted the horizon in hues of gold and crimson, Cael and Lyra stood at the edge of the whispering forest, their breaths visible in the crisp morning air. The journey ahead was fraught with danger, but the promise of the dragon's heart, a relic said to hold the essence of dragonkind itself, was too great to ignore. With a shared glance, the pair stepped forward, their footsteps crunching against the frost-covered ground, each step carrying them deeper into the unknown. Days turned into nights as they trekked through rugged terrain, the landscape shifting from dense forests to barren, windswept plains. It was there, amidst the endless expanse of cracked earth and swirling dust, that they encountered the nomadic tribe. Their tents, woven from the hides of ancient beasts, dotted the horizon like islands in a sea of sand. The tribe's people moved with a quiet grace, their eyes sharp and knowing, as if they carried the weight of countless generations within their gaze. At the center of the camp stood Sariel, the tribe's leader. Her silver hair cascaded like a waterfall, and her voice, when she spoke, carried the weight of centuries. "You seek the dragon's heart," she said, her piercing gaze locking onto Cael. It was not a question. Cael nodded, his throat dry, as Sariel continued, her tone both solemn and foreboding. "Be warned, young rider, the heart is no mere tool. It is a mirror, reflecting the soul of its wielder. It amplifies what lies within strength, courage, but also greed, anger, and despair. Many have sought its power, but few have returned unchanged." Her words hung heavy in the air, stirring a storm of doubt within Cael. Could he trust himself to wield such power? Would he be strong enough to resist the darkness that seemed to lurk at the edges of his heart? He glanced at Lyra, her scales shimmering faintly in the firelight, and felt a pang of unease. There was something different about her lately, a restlessness, a brightness that grew with each passing mile. She seemed almost drawn to the heart, her eyes gleaming with a fervor that Cael had never seen before. As the tribe shared stories of their ancestors, who once served the dragons as protectors and allies, Cael couldn't shake the feeling that he was standing on the precipice of something far greater than himself. The dragon's heart was not just a relic, it was a test, one that would challenge everything he believed about strength, loyalty, and the true nature of power. And as the fire crackled and the stars wheeled overhead, Cael couldn't help but wonder, would he rise to the challenge, or would the darkness within him consume them both? The shattered waste stretched before Cael and Lyra like a vast, unforgiving sea of cracked earth and jagged rock. This was no ordinary wasteland. It was a graveyard of ancient wars, where the very ground seemed to pulse with the echoes of battles long past. The air was thick with tension, and the sky churned with storms that never seemed to end. Lightning split the heavens, and winds howled as if mourning the lives lost in this forsaken place. But the storms were the least of their worries. The shattered wastes were home to creatures born of chaos, twisted, monstrous beings that lurked in the shadows, waiting for prey. Cael and Lyra faced them head-on, their bond growing stronger with each challenge. Lyra's instincts were razor-sharp, her movements fluid and precise, as if she could sense danger before it struck. Cael, once hesitant, began to trust her completely. Together, they were unstoppable. Yet as they pressed deeper into the wasteland, Cael couldn't shake the feeling that something was changing, not in the land, but in Lyra. There were moments when her eyes flickered with an unnatural, almost otherworldly light. It was faint, but unmistakable, and her emotions, once so clear to him, now seemed distant, as if she were drifting further away. He tried to brush it off, convincing himself it was just the stress of their journey. But deep down, he feared the truth. The dragon's heart was already taking hold of her. The artifact's power was legendary, but its cost was steep. It demanded sacrifice, and Cael couldn't ignore the possibility that Lyra was paying the price. He watched her closely, torn between admiration and dread. She was still the same fierce, loyal companion he had always known, but there was something new in her, something he couldn't quite name. As they navigated the treacherous terrain, Cael found himself wondering if the dragon's heart was a blessing or a curse. It had brought them this far, but at what cost? And as the eerie light in Lyra's eyes grew brighter, he couldn't help but fear what lay ahead. The journey was far from over, and the shadows of the shattered wastes seemed to whisper warnings that only he could hear. As Cael and Lyra approached the entrance to the dragon's heart, the air grew thick with an ancient energy, humming faintly like the echo of a forgotten song. Before them loomed a towering cavern, its entrance framed by jagged stone formations that seemed to twist and coil like the ribs of a long-slumbered beast. At its center stood the stone dragon, a colossal guardian carved with such lifelike detail that its eyes seemed to glimmer with a faint, otherworldly light. Its wings stretched wide, casting shadows that danced across the cavern walls, and its jaws were frozen in a silent snarl. This was no mere statue. It was a sentinel, waiting for those who dared to seek the heart. Cael stepped forward, his boots crunching against the loose gravel. A deep, resonant voice echoed through the cavern, shaking the ground beneath his feet. "To enter, you must prove your worth," it boomed, the words reverberating like thunder. "Answer this: what binds the rider to the dragon, stronger than steel, deeper than blood?" Cael's mind raced. The riddle was cryptic, its meaning shrouded in layers of mystery. He glanced at Lyra, her golden eyes fixed on him with unwavering trust. Yet for a moment, doubt crept in. What was the answer? Was it courage, loyalty, something more? As he pondered, the tension in the air grew palpable. The stone dragon's eyes seemed to pierce through him, demanding an answer. Cael closed his eyes, shutting out the noise, and focused on the bond he shared with Lyra, the bond that had carried them through countless trials. It wasn't just about trust or companionship. It was something deeper, something that defied words. It was the unspoken understanding, the shared heartbeat, the unity of two souls intertwined. "The bond," he said finally, his voice steady but filled with conviction. "The bond between rider and dragon is stronger than steel, deeper than blood." For a moment, there was silence. Then, the stone dragon's eyes flared with a brilliant light, and the ground trembled as it began to move. Its massive wings unfurled, scattering dust and debris, and its stone scales shimmered with an iridescent glow. The guardian stepped aside, its head bowing slightly in acknowledgement. The path to the dragon's heart was now open. Inside the cavern, the air was alive with energy. The walls sparkled with veins of luminescent crystal, casting an ethereal glow that illuminated the space. At the center of it all was the dragon's heart, a massive, pulsating crystal suspended in midair, surrounded by swirling tendrils of light and shadow. The sight was breathtaking, its power almost tangible. Cael could feel it calling to him, a magnetic pull that drew him closer with each step. But as he reached out, Lyra let out a sudden, guttural roar, her body tense and her eyes wide with alarm. Something was wrong. The heart's power was intoxicating, but it was also dangerous, and Lyra's warning was clear. Tread carefully, for the heart's allure could easily become a trap. The cavern echoed with the clash of steel and the roar of flames as the shadow riders descended upon them, their black armor glinting in the flickering light. At their head stood Malachar, his cold gaze fixed on the dragon's heart, pulsating with raw, untamed energy. Cael and Lyra barely had time to react before the battle erupted around them, the air thick with the scent of smoke and the cries of combat. Cael's mind raced as he fought, torn between the weight of the choice before him. The dragon's heart could save Lyra, but at what cost? If Malachar seized its power, the world would fall into chaos. Lyra, her movements swift and desperate, seemed to sense his hesitation. With a determined cry, she lunged toward the heart, her hands outstretched. Before Cael could stop her, the energy surged into her body, a brilliant light enveloping her form. But as the light faded, something was wrong. Her once vibrant eyes now gleamed with an inky blackness, her figure growing taller, more imposing, radiating an aura of power that felt both awe-inspiring and terrifying. Cael's heart sank as he realized the truth. The heart had not just awakened her strength, it had unleashed the darkness buried deep within her. The cavern fell silent for a moment, the Shadow Riders momentarily stunned by Lyra's transformation. Malachar's lips curled into a cruel smile as he stepped forward, his voice dripping with triumph. "You've done the work for me," he sneered, his eyes locking onto Lyra's darkened gaze. Cael tightened his grip on his sword, his mind a whirlwind of fear and resolve. He had to find a way to reach her, to pull her back from the edge before it was too late. But as Lyra turned her gaze toward him, her expression unreadable, he knew the battle ahead would be unlike anything they had faced before. The air grew heavy as Lyra, her eyes blazing with the unnatural light of the heart's power, turned toward Cael. The bond they once shared seemed frayed, almost forgotten, as she lunged at him with a ferocity that shook the very ground beneath them. Her claws slashed through the air, each strike radiating raw, untamed energy. Cael, though battered and bruised, stood firm. He refused to raise a hand against her, his voice trembling as he called out to her, pleading for her to remember the nights beneath the stars, the battles fought side by side, the unspoken trust that had always bound them together. For a heartbeat, Lyra hesitated. The fire in her eyes flickered, and in that fleeting moment, the Lyra Cael knew seemed to surface, struggling against the darkness that had consumed her. But before she could respond, a shadow loomed. Malachar, ever the opportunist, saw his chance and struck. His blade gleamed as it arced toward Cael, swift and merciless. Yet, in an act that defied the heart's corruption, Lyra moved. With a roar that echoed across the battlefield, she threw herself between Cael and the oncoming strike, shielding him with her own body. The blow landed with a sickening thud, and she crumpled to the ground, her once gleaming scales now dull and lifeless. Cael's heart shattered as he watched her fall. Grief and rage surged through him, a tempest of emotions too vast to contain. The heart's power, which had once seemed so foreign and dangerous, now pulsed within him, answering his anguish. He rose, his body radiating an otherworldly glow, and with a cry that shook the heavens, he unleashed a wave of energy, so immense it sent the Shadow Riders reeling. The force of it sent ripples through the air, driving back the darkness that had threatened to consume them all. But as the dust settled, Cael's triumph turned to despair. Lyra lay motionless, her breath shallow, her scales dimming with each passing second. The heart's power had saved them, but at what cost? Cael knelt beside her, his hands trembling as he reached out, hoping against hope that the bond they shared could still bring her back. The battlefield fell silent, the weight of their sacrifice hanging heavy in the air. The fight was far from over, but in that moment, all that mattered was the dragon who had given everything to protect him. The air in the cavern was heavy, thick with the lingering remnants of the heart's dark energy. Cael's arms trembled as he cradled Lyra, her body limp and lifeless, her face pale against the dim glow of the cavern walls. But his resolve was unshakable. Every step he took was a battle against exhaustion, every breath a reminder of the weight he carried, not just Lyra, but the fate of their world. Sariel's words echoed in his mind, a faint but steady beacon in the chaos. The heart has two faces, one of destruction, one of creation. Only love and sacrifice can balance its power. With a deep, shuddering breath, Cael laid Lyra gently on the ground. His hands shook as he reached for the heart, its pulsating light now dim and erratic. He could feel its darkness clawing at him, trying to seep into his soul, but he fought back with every ounce of will he had left. Love, he realized, wasn't just a feeling. It was a choice, a force stronger than any magic. And sacrifice, that was the price of wielding it. Summoning the last reserves of his strength, Cael placed his hands on the heart and willed its energy to flow, not into himself, but back into the crystal shard that had once contained it. The air crackled, the ground beneath them trembling as light and shadow clashed in a blinding surge. For a moment, it felt as though the world itself might tear apart. Then, with a final deafening pulse, the heart's energy was sealed once more within the crystal. Lyra stirred, her eyelids fluttering open. Her eyes, once clouded with the heart's corruption, were clear and bright again. She looked up at Cael, confusion giving way to recognition, then relief. "Cael," she whispered, her voice barely audible, but before she could say more, Cael's strength gave out. He crumpled to his knees, his body drained, his vision blurring at the edges. The sound of footsteps echoed through the cavern, growing louder with each passing second. The surviving Dragonriders emerged from the shadows, their faces etched with determination. They had followed Cael and Lyra, drawn by the pull of the heart and the hope that still burned within them. Together, they formed a circle around the two, their presence a silent promise of unity. Lyra, though still weak, rose to her feet beside Cael. Her hand found his, their fingers intertwining. The bond between them, forged through trials and tempered by sacrifice, was stronger than ever. Around them, the Dragonriders stood tall, their dragons roaring in unison, their combined strength a force to be reckoned with. The final battle loomed on the horizon, but for the first time, Cael felt a flicker of hope. They were not alone, and as long as they stood together, there was a chance to end the darkness, to reclaim their world, and to prove that even in the face of overwhelming odds, love and sacrifice could light the way. The cavern fell silent, the weight of what lay ahead settling over them like a storm cloud. But in that silence, there was also resolve. The time had come to face their greatest challenge, and they would face it as one. The skies above the Shadow Riders' stronghold churned with chaos as Cael and Lyra soared at the head of the Dragonrider assault. Their bond, forged through countless trials, pulsed with an unshakable resolve. Below, the ground trembled under the weight of clashing armies, while above, dragons roared and collided in a storm of fire and fury. This was no ordinary battle. It was a reckoning, a moment where courage and unity would be tested like never before. Cael's dragon, a massive creature with scales like molten bronze, tore through the enemy ranks with ferocious precision. Beside him, Lyra's silver-winged mount darted like a blade of light, her every move a dance of grace and destruction. Together, they carved a path through the chaos, their synergy unmatched. The Shadow Riders, though formidable, could not withstand the relentless advance of the Dragonriders. Yet amidst the carnage, one figure stood as a dark beacon of defiance, Malachar, the Shadow Riders' commander. As the battle reached its peak, Cael and Malachar locked eyes across the battlefield. Without a word, they spurred their dragons into a deadly duel. Fire clashed against shadow, each strike shaking the air with its intensity. For a moment, it seemed as though the outcome hung in the balance, until Lyra intervened. With a cry that echoed across the skies, she unleashed a blinding burst of pure light, a power drawn from the deepest connection between rider and dragon. The light engulfed Malachar, incinerating him in an instant and scattering his forces into retreat. The shadow riders, now leaderless and broken, fled into the shadows from whence they came. The Dragonriders stood victorious, but the cost of their triumph was etched in the scars of the battlefield. Cael and Lyra exchanged a silent glance, their bond stronger than ever, yet tempered by the knowledge that their fight was far from over. The victory was theirs, but the war for the skies and the fate of their world had only just begun. The air was still, heavy with the weight of victory, as Cael and Lyra stood atop the stronghold, their silhouettes framed against the fading light of the setting sun. Below them, the remnants of the Shadow Riders' forces lay scattered, their dark influence finally broken. The dragon's heart, once a source of chaos and destruction, now rested in the earth, its radiant energy purified and sealed away. The land seemed to breathe a sigh of relief, as if it too had been waiting for this moment. Cael's gaze lingered on the horizon, his thoughts swirling like the winds that had carried them through countless trials. He thought of the sacrifices made, the battles fought, and the trust forged in the heat of adversity. It wasn't the strength of his sword or the power of the dragon's heart that had brought them here. It was something far greater. Lyra shifted beside him, her massive frame radiating a soft, ethereal glow. She nudged him gently, her golden eyes reflecting the same quiet understanding. In that moment, Cael realized the truth that had eluded him for so long. True strength wasn't found in force or dominance. It was born from trust, from the unbreakable bond they had built together. He reached out, his hand resting on her warm scales, and felt the pulse of their connection, a bond that had withstood the darkest of nights. The prophecy had spoken of a great power, but it had never specified what that power truly was. Now, as they stood together, Cael understood. It wasn't about wielding the dragon's heart or defeating the Shadow Riders. It was about the unity between rider and dragon, the courage to face the unknown, and the willingness to sacrifice for something greater than oneself. The horizon stretched endlessly before them, a symbol of the future they had fought to protect. And as the first stars began to pierce the twilight sky, Cael knew their journey was far from over. Together, they had fulfilled the prophecy, not through might, but through the unyielding bond that had carried them through every storm.